Good afternoon. My name is Isabel Rohr. I'm the Deputy Director of the JDC Global Archives, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar. Before introducing our speaker, I'd like to say a few words about the JDC Archives for those of you who are not that familiar with us. The JDC Archives holds the records of the leading Jewish humanitarian organization, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, also known as JDC or the Joint, since its creation over 100 years ago. As such, it is one of the most important repositories for the study of modern Jewish history. Scholars from around the world, as well as family researchers, curators, journalists, and others use our archives for their research. We also offer fellowships to enable scholars to conduct research in our archives, and we offer public programs, virtual public programs such as today's. Our speaker today, Dr. Marcelo Dimentstein, is Director of Research and Evaluation at JDC Europe. He was trained as a social anthropologist, and since 2009, he has directed the research unit on contemporary Judaism at JDC's European office, the International Center for Community Development, JDC ICCD. In his position, he has coordinated numerous research projects on different phenomena of contemporary Jewish life in Europe. Marcelo teaches in different community leadership training seminars and oversees the strategies for measuring and evaluating the impact of JDC programs in the regions. His doctoral dissertation analyzed the transnational history of the reconstruction of Jewish communities after the fall of communism. The title of his talk today is, Are There Still Jews in Eastern Europe? The Rediscovery of Central and Eastern European Jews, 1984-1997. Our format is as follows. Dr. Dimentstein will speak for about 45 minutes. This will be followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. Please note that your microphones are muted, but that you can send us questions at any time during and after the presentation via the Q&A function on Zoom. Dr. Dimentstein will now start his presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Isabel, for this introduction, and I'm grateful also to JDC Archives for this invitation to present my research. I guess it's a double honor for me to be here today because first as a research presenting part of my research topic, but also as a JDC professional, which I am. Full disclosure. In fact, I came across the fascinating world of Eastern European Jews because of my work at JDC Europe, assisting Jewish communities. So I have to say that I'm also deeply, deeply grateful to JDC for this opportunity. So I'm going to share my screen. Hope everything is fine. Today's webinar is about how Eastern European Jews were rediscovered or began to be rediscovered by a constellation of Western actors, such as activists, journalists, Jewish agencies, intellectuals, among others. This is a process that started on the eve of the communist implosion and continued until the mid-90s, or even all along the 1990s. This topic was part of my PhD dissertation. Isabel explained my PhD dissertation was about analyzing the transnational effort of reconstructing Central and Eastern European Jewry after the fall of communism. In other words, while the political decomposition of the Soviet bloc was gaining traction and Jewish communities were re-emerging from communism, and Jewish philanthropic agencies were arriving to the region and started investing in those communities, Eastern European Jews began to be rediscovered and narratives about them began to be crafted. These narratives spoke about new Jewish identities or renaissance of Jewish culture or Jewish revivalism, but they also inquired about the ambiguous and the unsettled relationship that Eastern European of Jewish descent had both with Judaism and socialism. They inquired about Jewish communal life under communism, and while they were doing that, they sort of revisited the pre-war Jewish history of Eastern Europe, and they celebrated that, and they exalted the how sophisticated Jewish life was in capitals such as Prague, Berlin, or Budapest. This is what the webinar is going to speak about. We are going to try to identify the main elements that started to emerge and circulate into what constituted a renovated vision of Jewish life of Central and Eastern Europe. We are going to address this cycle of rediscovery, as I call it, by revisiting what I defined as the four isms: activism, journalism, tourism, a special kind of, and optimism. Each of these isms generated its own cultural production. They were led by different kinds of people, of course, and they responded to different contexts and different purposes. As we shall see also, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the demise of communism introduced not only a qualitative change in these cultural productions, but also a quantitative one. If this process began cautiously, circumscribed to a circle of devoted specialists and observers, after the demise of communism, the trickle became a flood, and the topic became somehow mainstream among a wider audience. Overall, I expect to show two sort of working hypotheses. First of all is that in this period, a radical change took place in the way Jews from Eastern Europe had been portrayed so far. And the second is that these new narratives came to support the work of Jewish philanthropic agencies that were arriving to the region, and they started to invest in those Jews and their communities. So we're going to start with the first ism, which is activism. I just mentioned that this cycle of rediscovery started among a circumscribed circle of devoted observers. These were Jewish activists, maybe also some Jewish agencies, for sure Jewish agencies working in advocacy field, and specialists who had been monitoring the region since perhaps 1945. Among the most prominent ones of those activists were, of course, the people from the movement Let My People Go, who, as we know, struggled for the right of Soviet Jews to emigrate. In this context, in 1968, a group of Eastern European émigrés and Anglo-Jewish scholars founded in London the journal Soviet Jewish Affairs, which was devoted to informing and following the developments affecting, above all, Jews in the Soviet Union, but not only, Jews from the Soviet satellites as well. Halfway between a scholarly journal and an activist publication, a typical issue of Soviet Jewish Affairs could contain different types of things, could be reports on a variety of aspects pertaining the life and culture of Jews in the Soviet Union, historical contributions about Jewish life and anti-Semitism in pre-communist countries, leaked documents annotated by the Soviet Jewish Affairs editors, illegal literature coming from Russia called in Russian samizdat, manifests, and so on. No doubt, Soviet Jewish Affairs' eyes were firmly fixed in the Kremlin, and their main concern was, to use Elie Wiesel's expression, the Jews of silence, the Jews from the Soviet Union. However, towards 1987, the journal adopted a veritable change of perspective regarding specifically Central and Eastern European Jewry. Suddenly, among its pages, one could find information about a newly detected phenomenon, that of a re-emergence of Jewish identity and increasing interest of individuals of Jewish origin in topics related with Judaism. Not only that, they started to inform about the increasing openness with which non-Jewish intellectuals and dissidents began to speak about the so-called the Jewish question, thereby revisiting the role or questioning, in a way, the role that their countries and their co-nationals had during the Holocaust. That issue was a taboo under communism. And last but not least, they started to inform about the increasing liberalization of some communist governments towards Jews and Jewish organizations. A whole new set of events appeared to be taking place in the region. So we have here some examples that show how the mood changed pertaining Soviet Central and Eastern European Jews. For example, regarding the GDR, the German Democratic Republic in 1987, Lukas Hirsovich, which was at the time the editor of Soviet Jewish Affairs, introduced a couple of reports originally published in the news sheet of the Federation of Jewish Communities in the GDR. They consisted of minutes of general meetings held at the Gemeinde, the community, in 1986, in which something out of the ordinary was described. A number of individuals who were not members of the community but who had Jewish origins were, for the first time, expressing interest in organized Jewish life of East Berlin and were therefore approaching the community. A meeting was organized with these people at the community premises in 1986. And so the text goes. In late June 1986, the culture room was packed. Those invited were Berliners known to have admitted their Jewish parentage, but were not members of the community. We had invited people in the mid-30s to mid-40s age group, children of survivors, many of whom wished their own children to become familiar with Jewish tradition. Also in Czechoslovakia, signs of a timid renewal led by the younger generation were occurring amid a gloomy atmosphere. John Friedman, an American doctoral researcher that spent a couple of months in Prague in the late 80s, wrote a report for Soviet Jewish Affairs, and she said, and I quote, "Today," she said, "Czechoslovak Jewry is a small, dispersed, and for the most part aging community. The only activity is eating in the kosher dining room in the community building, not out of commitment to Jewish dietary practices, but because the food, by local standards, is good and, thanks to the subsidies of the American Joint Distribution Committee, quite cheap. The community was also caught by factionalization and personal animosities between dissident Jews and the communist-appointed functionaries who hold effective control of the community's life. And yet," she said, "a small number of individuals who participate actively in the life of the community without being officially members. These are people under 40 years of age whose efforts to provide themselves with a Jewish education, to live meaningful Jewish lives, and to create for themselves a vital Jewish culture are nothing less than astonishing." Other kind of topics were showcased by the Soviet Jewish Affairs during the late 1980s. One of those new topics consisted in the growing public reconsideration by different non-Jewish voices of the so-called Jewish question and the role played by the local population during the Holocaust. In 1988, Soviet Jewish Affairs published a transcription of a radio program aired in Budapest on May 1987, where 9 Hungarian personalities of the culture and the sciences answered the question, "Is there a Jewish question in Hungary?" While the responses collected agreed entirely with the existence of a Jewish problem in present-day Hungary, Soviet Jewish Affairs pointed out that the radio broadcast in itself was reflecting a major change operating in Hungarian society. In the last 10 years or so, a remarkable change has taken place. Hungarians have begun to indulge in soul-searching about their own role during the war, a process that may be described as coming to terms with the past. Parallel to this discussion of past Hungarian anti-Semitism and its intellectual responsibility for the preparation and carrying out of the extermination of Hungarian Jewry was an examination of present-day Hungarian society. Soviet Jewish Affair was perhaps the only reliable source of information about what was going on with Jews behind the Iron Curtain in the 80s. However, the fall of the Berlin Wall led to other specialized voices reporting on Jewish life. The fall led to the emergence of new interpretations based on what was perceived as the end of an era. It was now possible to look back over the last 45 years and try to explain that period from the Jewish standpoint. As a consequence, reports aiming at providing a comprehensive understanding of Jewish life in Eastern Europe during the post-war period began to see the light, scrutinizing the evolving policies of the communist authorities vis-à-vis the Jews, identifying salient events and turning points, and providing information about the internal dynamics of the communities. It turned out that while all the communist countries shared some common threats, each country presented specificities. It wasn't the same Romania than Hungary, it wasn't the same Hungary than the GDR, etc. However, I want to showcase in this presentation two examples of how perspectives and concerns started to change after 1981. The first, it's an opinion piece written by Michael Birnbaum in 1990 in the journal Shema, a journal of Jewish ideas, which was a quite widely circulated journal in the US about issues pertaining the American Jewish community. At that time, Michael Birnbaum was a scholar working at the Holocaust Museum in DC, and he said he went on a trip on 1990s to the Eastern Europe, and he came back with an idea. I believe, said Berman, and I quote, "It is time to establish a professional Jewish Peace Corps to serve communities in Eastern Europe." Birnbaum was particularly concerned by the new generation of Jewish leaders whom he thought had no Jewish skills or resources, which they desperately need. Take Bulgaria, for example, where a new generation of Jewish leaders have ousted their predecessors. By and large, the new leaders are professionals in their 30s and 40s, theater directors and journalists, lawyers and professors. They welcome their new responsibilities and are excited by the opportunity of preserving a remnant of Jewish life a generation after the Holocaust. They chose to express themselves as Jews, even though their background is tenuous. Some are intermarried, most men are uncircumcised, almost all are Jewishly uneducated, yet these handicaps do not diminish their dedication. It doesn't matter if such an influx of Jewish professionals comes from Israel or the United States. What is important is that such a Peace Corps is forthcoming from the West, so that the remnant can have a fighting chance to regain its Jewish identity before even the memory of Jewish memories fades. The Jewish Peace Corps, envisioned by Berman, was designed to have a twofold mission. On one hand, it would instill Jewish values and traditions to a generation that grew up in a state of complete ignorance with regards to the most basic Jewish principles. And on the other, it would provide Jewish leaders with operational skills and basic know-how on how to run efficient and modern Jewish communities. We know all too well that such Jewish Peace Corps never existed, at least as Michael Birnbaum seemed to have envisioned it. Instead, a myriad of Jewish agencies and organizations stemming from different ideological and religious background arrived in the region. However, in a sense, Birnbaum's article senses an essential aspect of the process that was about to unravel in the years to come. The fact that rebuilding Jewish life in post-communist Eastern Europe would be the result of a collective enterprise. And in fact, what you see on screen right now, it's pertains to one of the main philanthropic bodies that was present after the fall of the Berlin Wall, but also before. This is a report written by Yehiel Bar Chaim, which at the time was a professional working for JDC. Yehiel was an American Israeli, and he lives in Prague right now. He was very active as JDC professional during the 90s in the former Czechoslovakia, in the former Yugoslavia as well, before and during and after the Balkan War. And in 1990, it turns out that Yehiel traveled to Sofia in what represented the first official visit of a JDC representative since the 40s. He met the Jewish community leaders. He wanted to assess the situation and determine in which options for JDC had JDC to re-entry Bulgaria. We see here the facts that Yehiel sent to the New York leadership of JDC. There he described the situation he found during his visit in these terms. He said, there are no regular prayers in Sofia except on holidays for this community of perhaps 3,000 Jews. We were told that there are occasional bar mitzvahs and weddings, but we were unable to judge how often. Kashrut is virtually unknown, and most holidays are barely dates on the JDC calendar, which is hung on the wall. There's a tradition of JDC distributing Jewish calendars to communities worldwide, for those who don't know. Finally, welcome back to Bulgaria after being invited to live in the late 40s. The joint now has many opportunities open. Therefore, Yehiel suggested a first initial intervention by JDC that included sending youngsters to Jewish summer camps, providing Sofia and Plovdiv, the two main cities in Bulgaria, with JDC-sponsored libraries, inviting Bulgarian Jewish leaders to JDC-sponsored leadership seminars, and laying the groundwork for financial and social assistance to the old, the needy, and the handicapped. This was, of course, far from being a Jewish Peace Corps, as Michael Bermond envisioned, but it truly reflects how international Jewish bodies began to invest in the rebuilding of Jewish life. So let's move towards the second ism that I presented at the beginning, journalism. So far, I presented some examples of those voices that I called specialists or activists, which were observers, specialists, Jewish professionals who had been closely monitoring and following people and events in Eastern Europe during decades. Yet, Jewish Eastern Europe aroused a curiosity and a fascination that well exceeded the interest of this restricted circle of specialized observers and activists of previous decades. Therefore, other narratives aimed at wider audiences presented more captivating descriptions of Jewish life during those years. They were produced mainly by professional journalists who combined their first-hand impressions on the ground with concrete, fresh, flesh into the bones life histories and good doses of historical divulgation. These narratives not only reconstituted the history of the local Jewish communities, scrutinizing the role of Jewish leadership and other key actors of those years, but also resorted to life histories in order to shed light on the vicissitudes of real people of Jewish origins living behind the Iron Curtain. By doing so, they aimed at bringing the Eastern European Jewish experience closer to the American Jewish sensitivities. There are two examples that I would like to focus and highlight here today. Probably you read these books. They appeared in the 90s. One is called Grey Dawn by Charles Hoffman, and the other it's called A Hole in the Heart of the World by Boston Globe correspondent at that time, Jonathan Kaufman, that was published in 1997. Both books share the goal of making the Jewish Eastern European experience accessible to Jewish American audiences, certainly ignorant about the fate of Jews under communism, but also not necessarily familiarized with the pre-war Jewish life. As Kaufman put it, I had come to Europe familiar with the Holocaust, but, like most Americans, ignorant about what happened afterwards. that there were any Jews at all in Germany and in Eastern Europe after Hitler and Stalin was remarkable. Who were these Jews who survived Hitler, Stalin, and 45 years of communism? Who were their children? Why had they stayed? Why had they stayed? How had they coped? This quotation encapsulates and captures very nicely these kind of questions and type of inquiry that journalists, in particular Jonathan Kaufman, Charles Hoffman, came when they arrived to Europe, asked themselves and asked their audiences. While Grey Dawn was about restoring the whereabouts of Jewish communal life under communism, Kaufman's book resorted to oral histories to reconstruct the story of 5 very different Eastern European families in the 2 Germanys, in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. What I want to highlight anyway is that these journalistic accounts proposed some sort of a master narrative of Jewish experience in the region. One that began with the destruction of a vibrant civilization brought by the Holocaust, continued with suppression and survival under communism, with its heroes and traitors, and finished with the Jewish revival in the post-communist era and the challenges that laid ahead. Another powerful idea that became increasingly relevant thanks to journalistic work was that of challenging the assumption of Eastern European Jews being remnants. One of the early conveners of this idea was the American photojournalist Edward Sirota. Correspondent in Central Europe since 1985 for Time magazine, Sirota devoted his life to document through images contemporary Jewish life in East Central Europe as a way to raise awareness of the existence of a still active communist Jewry. By the way, the New York Times featured him and his organization just with an article just a week ago. Probably you came across the article. In fact, this is the first book he published, Out of the Shadows, and Sirota made crystal clear that he wished to challenge the assumption that considered Eastern European Jews as remnants, a premise that he himself had before the project began. And he explains it this way. I had a mission to produce the most comprehensive photographic study ever of the last Jews of Eastern Europe. However, I soon realized that my work would never be about the last Jews of Eastern Europe. Everywhere I went in what had once been socialist Europe, Jewish communities, no matter their numbers, were casting off their mantle of remnant like an old garment that no longer fit. In Budapest, I stopped by the Jewish high school each autumn to watch it grow, from 90 in 1988, 110 the next year, to 140. The entire concept of last Jews was beginning to sound, worse yet, misleading. Altogether, Eastern European Jews is an anachronism conjuring up a world tragically lost to us. Out of the Shadows presents contemporary portraits of Jewries of different Eastern European countries, of Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Bulgaria, and the German Democratic Republic. The reader is exposed to images of community leaders and some other prominent members of communal celebration and events, of official commemorations with dignitaries, of Jewish buildings such as synagogues, cemeteries, and community premises. And perhaps Sirota's photograph attests to a Jewish universe that in principle puts into question the idea of remnant. Although it is true that some of the photographs which show the prevalence of the elderly in the demographics of the community, the rundown Jewish installations, and the deserted synagogues and cemeteries could serve as a counterclaim. More accurately, what these photographs portray is the way organized Jewish life emerged from the communist experience, alive but weakened, and in desperate need of renewal. Sirota continued all along the 1990s to publish photographic books on Central European Jews, In 2000, Serota founded Centropa, the Historical Institute, an organization, a Vienna-based foundation dedicated to preserving the 20th century Jewish family stories from Central Eastern European Europe. And he continues to do so, as far as I understand. But I want to emphasize here, perhaps, is that Serota was more than a journalist in a way, or more than a traditional or a conventional journalist. And his work about Eastern European Jews could be framed as what I called a memory entrepreneur. And more about this in a minute. I wanted to go to the third ism that I mentioned, tourism. And you know that in parallel with these journalistic accounts, a vast remembrance phenomenon gained momentum among Western Jews in the late 80s and beginnings of the 1990s. Remembrance of Jewish Eastern Europe was expressed in commemorative books, in memoirs, in travel guides, in photographic diaries, in essays, and in preservationist initiatives. However, the most salient phenomenon was that of memorial tourism, which was encouraged first by the openness shown by some communist governments that even staged public commemorations inviting foreign Jewish personalities, just for example in Poland, the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. But then were popularized this memorial tourism once the Iron Curtain fell. The conditions were now open for Western Jews to sort of return in search of the past, a past sometimes directly linked to their families, like in Jonathan Safran Foer's Everything is Illuminated, or sometimes rather a collective past that they wanted to rediscover. What we see in the screen, for example, is one of the first editions of the Jewish Heritage Travel Book, originally issued in 1992 and republished on multiple occasions since then, being the last one in 2007 by National Geographic. And we will speak about the author Ruth Ellen Gruber in a minute. The thing is that memorial tourism among American Jews, but also among Israelis and among Western Europeans, took such amplitude that the anthropologist Jack Kugelmans wrote on the occasion of a YIVO exhibition depicting how Western Jews were going back to Europe. He wrote in 1993 the following: "Although I don't have precise figures on the size of the current Jewish tourism to Eastern Europe, the numbers are clearly on the rise, on the increase. And the fact is that no visitor to the area can look through a camera viewfinder and be assured that another American or Israeli will not suddenly appear to mar the pristine view. Major Jewish institutions, both in America and in Israel, now sponsor guided tours for members to various parts of Eastern Europe, particularly Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. Yet, some of these memorial initiatives discovered that Jewish life continued in Eastern Europe, and therefore their narratives sought to integrate that longing for lost civilization with this new revelation. Thus, memorial narratives became more complex and included a plight for local Jewish communities. And I just mentioned the concept of memory entrepreneur, which I borrowed. I borrowed this notion from memory studies. There are many cases around the world in which certain individuals or groups play the role of the so-called memory entrepreneurs. That is, they mobilize themselves in order to elaborate, transmit, and even struggle for placing particular historical narratives, often traumatic and related with political violence, in the public arena. In this case, it wasn't so much a struggle in search of public recognition by nation states and governments that mobilized these memory entrepreneurs, but rather a quest for exhuming, appropriating, and raising awareness of the Jewish experience in Eastern Europe, including the situation of post-communist Jews. Along with Serota, one of the memory entrepreneurs, or one of the most relevant ones, we can mention the author of the Jewish Heritage Travel Guide, which is Ruth Ellen Gruber. Like Serota, Gruber is an American journalist who had been living in Europe since 1974, working for United Press and for various magazines as well. And in the early 1990s, she started to promote, disseminate, and advocate Central and Eastern Europeans' Jewish legacy as a way to raise awareness about the resilience of a local, if weakened, and need of support Jewish life. On one hand, Gruber's and Serota's effort, like that of Charles Hoffman and Jonathan Kaufman as well, the journalists that we have mentioned, served to render the Jewish Central and Eastern European experience accessible to Western Jewish audience, especially to the memory travelers. But on the other hand, it attested, like everything is illuminated, to the emotional investment and passionate reconnection that the new and old generation of Western Jews began to tie with the land of their relatives and ancestors. Like Ruth Ellen Gruber said in the Jewish Heritage Travel Guide, I traveled thousands of miles to seek out physical remainings of a vanished civilization. Often I felt like an archaeologist digging and delving into the ruins of a past, my past, our past. The travel guide she authored was followed by the lengthier and intellectually more ambitious travel diary upon the doorpost of the house, where she narrates her experiences visiting different Jewish lieux de mémoire, sites of memory. And Gruber, in fact, continued her work as memory entrepreneur all along the 1990s and the 2000s, chronicling Jewish cultural developments in Europe and involved in the revival of the Jewish communal life. In 2002, she published Virtually Jewish, a book where she explores the increasing non-Jewish interest in Jewish history and culture in various European cities, where no more Jews were virtually left. And in September 2011, Gruber received the Knight's Cross of the Order of the Merit by Poland's government for her help in the understanding between Poles and Jews. Gruber currently coordinates an online project whose goal is to serve as an online resource for Jewish heritage in Europe. And forgot to mention that the picture you see on the screen is a young Ruth Ellen Gruber when she started her work as a memory entrepreneur. The last station in this journey has to do with optimism. This is the last trend that began to be noticeable by the mid-1990s, when the consolidation of the European Union and the perspective of a continental integration led some intellectuals to speak, not without optimism, we would say today, about new Jewish identities present in a new Europe. All in all, this literature was called to shape much of the public discourse of East Central European Jews in the years to come. Perhaps no other intellectual figure embodied the Jewish Euro optimism of those years than the French-Italian historian Diana Pinto, who in the mid-1990s elaborated the most articulated praise of the new social and political conditions prevailing in Europe. Conditions that, according to her, favored, like never before, the redevelopment of Jewish life in the continent. And I quote, "In the open pan-European space which emerged as a consequence of the fall of the Berlin Wall," she argued in a famous paper entitled A New Jewish Identity for Post-1999 Europe, European Jews lived in an entirely different continent from that of their pre-war forebears, their post-war parents, or even their own post-war selves. Never in the history of Europe has a moment been so propitious for its Jews as the present. Pinto's arguments represented the culmination, in a way, of this cycle of rediscovery that began in the mid-1980s and continued all along the 1990s. Here, the Eastern European Jewish presence was not fully acknowledged. but was also deemed essential for the constitution of a new pan-European Jewish identity. Moreover, Jews were called to play a central role in the building of the new democratic of multicultural Europe. Indeed, Pinto's ideas, popular between 1996 and the 2000s, helped shape much of the public discourse regarding post-1999 European Jews. But this is perhaps another story and would come afterwards. It's a matter of further debate. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Marcelo. This was fascinating presentation. I just want to add that Edward Serrota has taken many photos for the JDC, and these are available on our website and on our database if anyone is interested in seeing them. And I will now open the floor to questions. Just remember to send them via the Q&A function. And I see that we already have 3. So let me see. Let me see. I see that we have a few comments from people you've mentioned who are attending our webinar, including. Okay, so I'm going to start with the very first question we received. To what extent did your research on the immediate post-communist period in early 1990s examine the debate of whether Eastern European Jews should remain and rebuild Jewish life versus make Aliyah to Israel? What was the nature of that debate on the local community level?
Hi, Michael. Thank you for your question. This is an interesting question. Of course, there was some debate whether Jews had to leave to Israel or remain in Europe. Still, I think that my field of expertise it's the optics of Jewish philanthropic agencies rather than the local Jewish communities, and I would say that for the major Jewish philanthropic agencies such as the JDC or later on the Lauder Foundation, there wasn't much debate whether Jews had to go to Israel or not. But actually, they didn't made an opinion on that, but they immediately started to invest in the renewing and rebuilding of Jewish life on the assumption that Jewish life was going to be rebuilt and that Jews, even if some of them or a fragment of them wanted to go to Israel, many of them would remain, and conditions were now open. I said there was optimism in the air, and conditions were now open for Jews to rebuild their communities and their Jewish communal life. We have the transmigrants. What I didn't mention is that at the same time we have the transmigrants issue pouring into Vienna, Soviet Jews en route to America or to Israel, where JDC also had a major contribution. So many things were going on in the continent at the same time. And so it's a more complex picture, perhaps, that I just presented this afternoon.
Well, you only had 45 minutes.
Yeah.
So we have a question from Michael Bahraim, who used to work for JDC, who's director, and whose report you shared with the audience. And I'm going to summarize a little bit what he's asking here, but I think he wants to know if you can speak about the role of Jews in Sarajevo during the war there in 1992, 1995. And I suppose he mentions the work of La Benevolencia, the role of JDC. So I don't know if this is part of your research, but if it is,
not really. I know, of course, the role of Benevolencia in rescuing Jews, but not only Jews. The role of Yehiel, instrumental in that. Serrota with his book about the La Benevolencia as well. It deserves, I think there was a webinar specific about this issue that you can search and review were in YouTube on the JDC archive. So I don't want to go further into this because it's a story in its own, I believe.
Exactly. We have, if anyone in the audience is interested in learning more about that topic, we've had a few years ago a webinar featuring Yahya al-Bahaim, and that discusses specifically the role of the Jews in Sarajevo during the war of 1992-1995. So I encourage you to view it.
Mm-hmm.
All of our webinars, by the way, are recorded, or most of them are, and are available on our website. Okay, so can you give us, whoops, things are jumping around. Hold on, I'm going to I'm trying to group them in a logical way, but I don't think I really have an option. Can you give specific examples of successful East European Jewish communities now in existence?
Well, yeah, sure. Given that, I mean, in a way, all of them are successful in a way that they are living, existing, and current Jewish communities in all Eastern European countries. We used to call them post-communist. We know that I'm going to give you criteria for success. We used to call them until recently in JDC. I'm going to use my JDC hat here. We used to call them until recently post-communist communities. And very recently we reached the conclusion that that garment, like Serota used to say for Eastern Europe, that garment no longer fit to describe these communities. These are communities that are standing on their feet. Many of them are economic self-sufficient because of a variety of reasons, but most of them manage restored property that was confiscated in the Nazi and the era under communism. They have a strong leadership. They are very well integrated into pan-European organizations, and they have a younger membership base. Since I saw in the Q&A that many are asking, or a couple are asking about Bulgaria, perhaps I can point out that the Bulgarian Jewish community in Sofia, it's an example of a successful community with all the institutions in place, with a very strong strategic vision about the future, that used to receive a lot of support with JDC, but now no longer. I mean, we work in partnership with them, and this I would point, it's an example of a successful community today in Europe, or in Eastern Europe, or the former communist Europe. So I don't know if I answered that question.
I think you did. And I see that someone is actually going to be touring Bulgaria and is asking where to find information about the prominent Jewish sites.
Perhaps in the site of that Ruth is curating right now.
Heritage
Yeah.
Europe, right? Is that the website? So yes, we'll encourage you to look at that website. What role has the European Union played in the recovery of those communities?
Very important question, and I would say a very important one. And I'm going to be more specific. Financially, you know that I wouldn't say European Union, but I would say European countries. You know that some European countries established because of reparations, because of property that has been stolen during the Nazi era, and the claims that Jewish communities did upon those governments. The solution that many Western European countries found at some point in the 90s was to create foundations, or with funds on it, and somehow give that funds to Jewish community foundations or organizations that they will manage, and they will transfer that funds, how to use that funds for. And I'm thinking, for example, in France, Fondation Mémorial de la Shoah, it's funded by this sort of arrangements. The Dutch Humanitarian Fund is also funded by that kind of arrangement, not to mention the Claims Conference and the role that it had not only in supporting Nazi victims, but also through the Foundation for Jewish Culture, the New York-based organization that then channeled money in into Jewish communities. So there's a whole, as I said, transnational effort that, not only Jewish effort, that was involved in rebuilding Jewish life in the eastern half of the continent after the fall of communism.
What are the percentages of Jews in, well, Western, Central, and Eastern Europe? I think that's a big question, and probably it varies a lot from countries to countries, right? So
Yeah, I don't want. Also, it very much depends. I follow very faithfully here the renowned demographer based in Israel, Sergio de la Pergola, who sort of say, okay, depending, who we count as Jews, whether if core Jews, as we say, or lawful return Jews, or well, it is more or less understood that in Europe, 1.3 million Jews live actually across the continent. That makes, as a whole, Europe the third pillar of world Jewry, after, of course, the US and Israel. But it very much depends on how we count Jews, and especially if there's an overall trend anyway that, more and more Jews are concentrated in the western part of the continent, in Western Europe. And this is something to take into consideration. And even if Eastern European communities are still functioning and alive, this is something to take into consideration.
now we have a question that touches upon the beginning of the beginning of the webinar, when you mentioned the Journal of Soviet Jewish Affairs. Who published it? What languages were the articles written in?
In English.
In English.
Yeah, in English. Mainly in
Was it the
English.
World Jewish Congress? Did I see the
Yeah.
World Jewish Congress there?
It was published by the World. Yeah, I didn't mention that, but it had support from the World Jewish Congress, the Jewish Soviet Jewish Affairs, and all of them all the documents were translated into English and published into English.
And when did they start publishing? Do you know when the publication
In
started?
1968, and went until the fall of the Berlin. It appeared at irregular intervals. The first issue was called actually Bulletin of Soviet Jewish Affairs in Eastern Europe. Then they changed the name, and finally they adopted this Soviet Jewish Affairs as the ultimate name. But as said, their main concern was about Soviet Jews, that is Russian Jews, but Eastern European Jews appeared on different moments of the journals. In my dissertation, I speak about that more widely, but definitely a very interesting publication and a good method to travel back in time of those times.
Marcelo, earlier on, someone asked for the exact title of your dissertation. Can you please give it to us?
Yeah, very good. Dissertations have long names, and now
I know.
But I think it's the role of transnational Jewish organizations in rebuilding Eastern European Jewish communities after the fall of communism, 1987, 1995, something like that.
Right, and it's written in French?
It's written in English.
English.
It's available. I started in Paris in the École de Haute Études en Sciences Sociales, but given that I moved to Barcelona, I finished and I defended my dissertation in Blanquerna University in Barcelona, where I'm living currently. And I think I can share the permit link to where people can download the dissertation.
Okay, I'm sure some people would be interested. We have a long question that I'm going to read out loud for our audience, and I'm sure you can see it
Mhm.
on the screen. Some of these national societies, like Lithuania and Estonia, have experienced dual rediscoveries since the Soviets left. One is the Jewish one, which you described, but another that is resonant with this is the rediscovery of culture and wisdom from their 1,000-year-old pagan religion and culture, teaching them to respect and trade fairly with other cultures, such as Jews. Can more be done to develop these forces? The Lithuanian government has had a program like this, led by the senior progressive personality in the parliament, and the person seems to be involved with this, and wants to know your views. So it sounds that it's, yeah. I don't know if you can.
I thought that when I heard the sentence dual rediscoveries, I thought that he was making reference to Herb was making reference to, in effect, dual rediscovery. It was a national liberation in a way as well, and so it was a dual thing. Although it has to be mentioned also that the Jews from those countries, from the Baltic countries, enjoyed some sort of more liberty than Jews in Russia, and in fact, the problem that had those communities when the communists fell is that the main cadres of the Jewish communities, the main Jewish leadership, had already made Aliyah in the 80s, and the problem they had was to replacing that strong leadership they had. But I wasn't that aware of that religious or cultural heritage that Herb is bringing here in this conversation, which I found fascinating, and actually wasn't that fully aware of the presence in Estonia and Lithuania.
We have a question about I believe that we now have a link to your dissertation in the chat.
Very
We
quick.
also have a link to the Jewish Heritage website for anyone interested in looking at that. We have a question on the role that the immigration of Jews to Israel and US played in the rejuvenation, I would say, of the Jewish communities in East and Central Europe. I don't know if you want to say
Well,
something.
I mentioned. I mean, if we are talking about that particular time period, for example, a country like Bulgaria, also, it is considered that almost 90% of the community during communism, because of the particularities of the communist government in Bulgaria, made Aliyah. And so what actually revived after the fall of communism was the other 10% that stay in Bulgaria and sort of put the Jewish community back together. I also mentioned the fact of the leadership in the Baltic countries that made Aliyah even before the fall of communism, and that was a challenge that many Jewish communities had to face when reviving. Others, like Poland, I don't think that was the case, or the Czech Republic. I don't have the exact numbers of people who made Aliyah right after communism. So I will have to inquire deeper on that.
And was there also a movement westward within Europe to Germany, for instance?
Absolutely, definitely Russian-speaking Jews, the influx of Russian-speaking Jews, again, before the fall of communism, but especially right after the fall of communism, because of a special program that the German government put in place, the influx of Soviet or Russian-speaking Jews from different parts of the Soviet Union going to different parts of Germany, spread out in Germany, absolutely revived and changed the Jewish demography of Germany until today. And so, absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Marcelo. We'll share with you the questions we've not had a chance to ask. And I also want to thank our participants for joining us today. Our next webinar will take place on November 12th. Polly Zavadivka will give a talk about her book, a nation of refugees, Russia Jews in World War I. You can register for it via our website. Please sign up for our newsletter if you would like to be added to our mailing list for upcoming public programs. And I want to thank everyone, and I hope to see you soon again at other programs.